Welcome to episode 140 of Lucretius Today. This is a podcast dedicated to the poet Lucretius, who wrote On the Nature of Things, the only complete presentation of Epicurean philosophy left to us from the ancient world. I'm your host, Cassius, and together with our panelists from the EpicureanFriends.com forum, we'll walk you through the ancient Epicurean texts, and we'll discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. We encourage you to study Epicurus for yourself, and we suggest the best place to start is the book Epicurus and His Philosophy by Canadian professor Norman DeWitt. If you find the Epicurean worldview attractive, we invite you to join us in the study of Epicurus at EpicureanFriends.com, where you'll find a discussion thread for each of our podcast episodes and many other topics. Today we complete our discussion of Epicurus' letter to Menoeceus. Now let's join Kalosyni reading today's text.
For indeed, who think you is a better man than he who holds reverent opinions concerning the gods, and is at all times free from fear of death, and has reasoned out the end ordained by nature? He understands that the limit of good things is easy to fulfill and easy to attain, whereas the course of ills is either short in time or slight in pain. He laughs at destiny, whom some have introduced as the mistress of all things. He thinks that with us lies the chief power in determining events, some of which happen by necessity, and some by chance, and some are within our control. For while necessity cannot be called to account, he sees that chance is inconstant, but that which is in our control is subject to no master, and to it are naturally attached praise and blame. For indeed, it were better to follow the myths about the gods than to become a slave to the destiny of the natural philosophers. For the former suggests a hope of placating the gods by worship, whereas the latter involves a necessity which knows no placation. As to chance, he does not regard it as a god as most men do, for in a god's acts there is no disorder, nor as an uncertain cause of all things, for he does not believe that good and evil are given by chance to man from the framing of a blessed life, but that opportunities for great good and great evil are afforded by it. He therefore thinks it better to be unfortunate in reasonable action than to prosper in unreason. For it is better in a man's actions that what is well chosen should fail rather than what is ill chosen should be successful owing to chance. Meditate therefore on these things, and things akin to them, night and day by yourself, and with a companion like to yourself, and never shall you be disturbed waking or asleep, but you shall live like a god among men. For a man who lives among immortal blessings is not like unto a mortal being.
Okay, very good. Thank you for reading that for us this morning, Kalosyni. We are now at the end of the letter to Menoeceus. We've been covering a lot of important material on how to live, and now at the end of the letter, he's making several points regarding determinism and personal responsibility, and that it would be better to be involved in a false religion than it would be to be a slave of hard determinism. So there's some interesting material here today that we can use to complete the letter, and then at the end of the episode, hopefully we'll have some time to talk about in general the full impact of the letter to Menoeceus and how it fits into the Epicurean worldview. But let's start with 133. For indeed, who think he was a better man than he who holds reverent opinions concerning the gods and death, and has reasoned out the end ordained by nature?
Right, and on that note, Cassius, let me read a little bit of something else. This is a very similar passage, and it comes from the Torquatus material in Cicero's On Ends. He says, "Let us imagine a man living in the continuous enjoyment of numerous and vivid pleasures, alike of body and of mind, undisturbed either by the presence or by the prospect of pain. What possible state of existence could we describe as being more excellent or more desirable? One so situated must possess in the first place a strength of mind that is proof against all fear of death or of pain. He will know that death means complete unconsciousness, and that pain is generally light if long and short if strong, so that its intensity is compensated by brief duration and its continuance by diminishing severity. Let such a man, moreover, have no dread of any supernatural power. Let him never suffer the pleasures of the past to fade away, but constantly renew their enjoyment in recollection, and his lot will be one which will not admit of further improvement. So that's very similar to what we're reading in the very end of the letter to Menoeceus. And it's probable, I think, that Cicero is reading the letter to Menoeceus and taking that out and inserting it into the Torquatus monologue. And he's doing that because obviously this is a very important passage and a very important end to a very important letter. And in fact, as we go through this is the last letter, so we'll have gone through them all.
You know, Joshua, as you bring up that point, it's interesting to think about how the Torquatus material in Cicero, the manuscript of that is actually earlier than the letter that we're reading in Diogenes Laertius. To some extent, I'm beginning to think that the Torquatus material appears to come from something that is obviously more detailed than the letter to Menoeceus is. And I wonder if the Torquatus material is a better representation of the full picture even than this letter to Menoeceus is. Presumably, Cicero is reading from something, and maybe it's the letter to Menoeceus, or maybe it's some larger work. Presumably, it is some larger work that comes down from the Epicureans. And you would think that they had something more detailed than this letter that they were going by as their primary reference source. So it's interesting to think about whether the Torquatus material in its greater detail is actually a better indication of some aspects of the philosophy than this letter itself is. You've got all the issues of who is Menoeceus and whether Epicurus was tuning it in a particular way to a particular recipient. But by the time several hundred years later Cicero is writing, he's got something in front of him that appears to be a more detailed and in-depth explanation of Epicurean philosophy. So I don't think there's any major inconsistencies or anything like that, but I think we can get a lot by doing exactly what you just did to read into the Torquatus material and see how it elaborates on it.
Yeah, and a feature of interest in Epicurean philosophy, and in fact in most ancient philosophy, classical, Mediterranean, Greek, Latin, Roman philosophy, is you get these vignettes of what makes a good person or what makes a wise person. Or the word that Diogenes Laertius always uses is the wise man or the sage, something like that. It's a portrayal of a life that we can model our own life after, I think is what it's set up to be. You know, the goal is not for Epicurus to write this letter so that people think he's the wisest person on earth and then everybody comes and follows him. His goal, I think, is to portray what he thinks a wise person looks like, or a person in better circumstances looks like, so that the people he's trying to reach can emulate that kind of life and improve their own life by doing so. And the gods, which are mentioned here very early on, in fact, the first sentence that we're reading today, for indeed, who think you is a better man than he who holds reverent opinions concerning the gods? So the gods themselves, as Epicurus portrays them, are another kind of example of a paragon or something that you can look to as being optimal, an optimal way to live, and thereby doing, hopefully, improve your own life. And even if you don't get to the point where you are living a life like the gods or you're living among immortal blessings, that kind of thing, even if you don't attain that state, you can always make some progress towards happiness. And it was Torquatus who comes down to us with that very famous quote where he says that Epicurus is the master builder, if I may style him so, of the life of happiness.
And Joshua, that's something very similar to what Martin and I were discussing before we started recording today. It's a sort of a continuing interest of mine to consider the issue of tranquility and how it fits into the philosophy, and pleasure, of course, as well. We've gone through 2 episodes where we were discussing those sections of the letter, but really those fit in the context that we're looking for the optimum way of life. We're not necessarily focused every moment on either pursuing a particular pleasure or even avoiding a particular pain. And as Epicurus says, we sometimes choose the pain, we sometimes avoid the pleasure for the sake of the ultimate outcome of what we think is going to be the best for us in terms of the balance. But there's a premise when we discuss pleasure and pain that we live only a short period of time. We're not responsible to a supernatural God or to some absolute list of things to do. So in order for us to really get our lives in order, we have to decide what is the best way of life, what is the optimum way of life. And just simply saying pursue pleasure, avoid pain doesn't answer the specific questions that all of us confront about how to spend our time today. And that's what it seems like to me he's deciding to sort of close this letter on here. He's gone back to the ultimate question of what is the best life. Certainly the best life involves pursuing pleasure and avoiding pain. It involves tranquility. It involves the different concepts that we talk about. But in order to bring into reality our big picture word discussion, it's helpful, it seems like he's saying, to think about what is the optimum picture, what is the framework of everything that you're attempting to accomplish. And so that's what we seem to be talking about here. There's a good list in the Torquatus material that you just read of the things that the better man, the best man is going to do. And as usual, just like he does in the principal doctrines, he goes back to the issues of having a holy belief about the gods, a correct belief about supernatural gods, and also to be free of the fear of death, which is principal doctrines 1 and 2. And then diligently consider the end fixed by nature, and the limit of good things can be reached and attained, and the duration and intensity of evils is slight. I mean, this is just a restatement of principal doctrines 3 and 4. So this section here we're talking about today is almost just a straight recap of principal doctrines 1 through 4. And as he goes forward, he brings in these other issues as well. We might as well go on to the next section about how he laughs at destiny, which some have introduced as the mistress of all things. And he thinks that within us lies the chief power in determining events, but that some happen by necessity, some by chance, and some are within our control, and obviously then some are not. For while necessity can't be called to account, he sees that chance is inconstant, but that which is in our control is subject to no master, and to it are naturally attached praise and blame. So why don't we go ahead and start talking about this personal responsibility aspect of Epicurus, because that's a highly controversial topic as well. The basic, I think, direction he's going in is if you're going to set up a goal, if you're going to identify what the optimum life is, you need to address whether you've got any ability to achieve that or not. If you don't have the ability to achieve it, then you're wasting your time, or even worse, by setting up some goal for life which is impossible to obtain. And if there's supernatural gods constantly getting in our way or frustrating us in our desires, that's one thing to worry about. But also this issue of chance. It was probably as obvious to them as it is to us, and this is where Epicurus differed from Democritus, that if the atomistic nature of the universe makes us just billiard balls that we're just constantly being buffeted around by outside events, then that eliminates our own possibility of steering our lives in a more successful direction.
I think I mentioned this in one of the Wednesday meetings. There was a movie that came out, The Hobbit, and there was a line at the very beginning of the movie in which Bilbo Baggins says, "Quite by chance and the will of a wizard, fate decided that I would have a part to play in this story." Now, this to me is just typical of the confusion that swirls around these issues of fate or destiny, of choice or free will, of chance, determinism. Most people, I think, don't really spend too much time thinking about why do we do the things we do? Do we do it because we were ordained to do it by a god? Do we do it because the universe is deterministic and we couldn't choose something else even if we wanted to? Do we do it because it's our fate or our destiny? You mentioned Democritus and hard determinism, and that was a problem for the philosophers in ancient Greece. But there was a religious problem also in ancient Greece, and that was this idea of fate. And it has given Greek drama so much of its interest and flavor because you've got these characters like Oedipus, for example, who, when he was born, he was son of a king, is my understanding, and there was an oracle at his birth, and the oracle said that this boy, if he grew up, would slay his father and bed his mother, right? And so, okay, now we've got, whether you want to call it the will of the gods or fate or destiny, we've got this problem hanging in the stars now. And they bind his feet or drill holes in his feet or something, and they throw him out into the wilderness. and he is taken in by a peasant farmer. This is one of the classic tropes of all literature is a prince taken in by a farmer in exile. He grows up and he goes on to what does he do? He solves the riddle of the Sphinx, I think. And then he goes on now to fulfill everything that the oracle said he would fulfill when he was born. And so the problem presented by fate or destiny in literature is that no matter how hard you run, you can't get away from it. There's an old story, it's preserved by W. Somerset Maugham, called Death in Samsara, something like, I can't remember the name of the town. Anyway, this guy sends his servant, this wealthy landowner sends his servant into town in order to get supplies for the household. And the servant comes back without the supplies. And the landlord goes, "What are you doing? I sent you to get supplies." And the servant says, "I was in the market getting supplies and I turned around and I saw death. And so I dropped everything and I fled back here." And now the landowner, who cared a great deal about this servant and didn't want him to die, gave him the fastest horse and sent him to the far-off town of Samara or whatever it is. And the servant gets to Samara, and as soon as he gets there, he's killed by death, basically, is what happens. Before that happens, though, the landowner then goes into town, goes to the market, finds Death, and says, "What are you doing? Why are you scaring my servant?" And Death says, "Well, I had no intention of scaring your servant. I was surprised because I wasn't expecting to see him here today because I have an appointment with him tomorrow in far-off Samara." So the landowner, in trying to circumvent the fate that his servant was coming to, had actually sent him directly to his death by sending him to this other town. What do we make of all this? I think Epicurus would say you need to accustom yourself to simply reject the idea. There is no fate. There is no destiny. These things do not have any control, any influence over the way that you live your life. And part of the problem is if you accepted that they did, then there's no reason to do anything now, because no matter what happens, I have a destiny and it's going to come for me whether I want it to or not, whether I try to reach it or not, whether I try to avoid it or not. It totally removes any will or ambition to do anything in life if you believe that there's a road that's been laid out for you and that it will happen no matter what you do.
Joshua, people are going to push back and say that when he says the chief power in determining events lies within us, the example that you just gave about the confrontation with death in that illustration, we ourselves have the ability to decide whether we want to kill ourselves today. We have tremendous power. If we decide to do that, then there won't be a tomorrow for us. And that supersedes any possible issues of fate or supernatural interference or undue control over your life, which is something we constantly run into nowadays. And I guess people always have, but we particularly think that way today, that events are out of our control. Well, they're not totally out of control. We can bring our lives to an end if we choose to do so. But more even than that, earlier in the letter, he's talked about how living the simple life and not wedding yourself to luxury is important, because you fear losing it if you get so attached to luxury that you just don't want to lose it. If you accustom yourself to simple living, it makes it a whole lot easier to walk away or to move to new areas or to take the actions that might be necessary to obtain a better life. If you decide to pick up and move across the country tomorrow, your life is going to be a lot different than if you stayed in the same place that you've been living previously. So he's affirmatively saying that there are things that are out of our control and some happen by chance, but there's an awful lot that is within our control if we choose to exert our willpower and our actions to make things happen. Again, it certainly makes it easier to do that if you accustom yourself to focusing on those things that are important in life and the basics, and not getting yourself attached with, I think there's all sorts of cliches about golden handcuffs, and that's what we've done in the modern world so many times through the commercialism and so forth. You live above your means and you feel like there's no way out. You feel trapped and you feel like the whole world is out of control. But those circumstances in many cases are the result of your own choices in the first place.
Cassius, you're giving the Greek oracles less than their fair due, because if they prophesied that you were going to die tomorrow and you killed yourself today, they would just change the prophecy. It's very easy to do. They did it all the time. Alexander the Oracle Monger told Marcus Aurelius, of all people, the emperor of Rome, that if he did this certain thing and waged the battle at this certain time, there would be a great victory. Well, he went on to do those things, and then the Romans suffered a terrible defeat, and Alexander the Oracle Monger said, we prophesied a great victory, but we did not say which side it would fall to. So,
well, let me continue with the direction you were going in, Joshua, because I think this is extremely important. 134, the section we would take up next, Epicurus has a tendency to just be in your face about things. And he says here that it would be better to follow the myths about the gods, which we've established over and over and over is not true in Epicurean philosophy. But he's saying it would be better to follow the lies, basically, of religion than to become a slave to the destiny of the natural philosophers, which I think is generally interpreted to mean hard determinism, those who are promoting that you have no ability to influence or change your own future. Because the former suggests a hope of placating the gods by worship, whereas the latter involves a necessity which knows no placation. And as he continues in that sentence, he says, as to chance, he does not regard it as a god, nor an uncertain cause of all things, for he does not believe that good and evil are given by chance to a man for the framing of a blessed life, but that opportunities for great good and great evil are afforded by it. And then the 135, he therefore thinks it better to be unfortunate in a reasonable action than to prosper in unreason. For it is better in a man's action that what is well chosen should fail, rather than what is ill chosen should be successful owing to chance. So that whole line of argument in 134 through 135, to me, that's putting the focus on your vigorously engaging with the events of your life that you choose and avoid in order to make good things happen to you and also to avoid bad things from happening to you. But that you're not a billiard ball, you're not a pawn of the gods, you're not a pawn of other people. It's better that you even fail, at least in trying to live happily, than to just by chance occasionally grasp a few scraps of pleasure here and there. Again, what I'm seeing in this type of material is that you're not just simply fleeing from pain. You're not just simply reaching for the immediate momentary pleasure that might be available to you. You're looking at the big picture of your life and where you fit in the universe, and you're trying to use your time as best you can. The Greeks were interested in living the best life. They had to determine what the best life is before they could live it, because they knew there was all this controversy about what they should be doing. But ultimately, they weren't just looking for anesthesia from pain. They were looking to identify what the goal of life should be so that they could then take steps to achieve that good life for themselves. Unless you know what the good life is, you don't know what to do. And you don't just let yourself be pushed around by events that you think are out of your control, because ultimately these events are not totally outside your control. And it's better for you to get engaged, use your mind aggressively, reasonably, scientifically, follow the evidence, and do the best you can, rather than just to sit back and hope that fate or chance is going to reward you for doing nothing.
Yeah, this is the way that Cassius, the other Cassius, in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, he's speaking to Brutus here, and this is the way he puts it. Men at some time are masters of their fates. The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves that we are underlings. So this is a hint of Epicureanism leaking again into one of Shakespeare's plays.
And of course, totally appropriately, since Cassius Longinus was an Epicurean himself, he would be making that point. Joshua, isn't there a related text about a tide in the affairs of men that once missed? That goes in the other direction. But do you know what I'm talking about? Is that not in the same section?
This is from Brutus speaking to Cassius. He says, there is a tide in the affairs of men, which, taken at the flood, leads on to fortune.
Now, not to turn this into a Shakespeare debate, but I see that as a little bit different, and appropriately so, coming from Brutus, who's thought of as a Stoic, but I think he's not a Stoic as much as he is a Platonist. But a tide in the affairs of men. Can you imagine Epicurus talking about a tide in the affairs of men? Does that contradict free will, or can that be consistent with it?
Well, he says, which taken at the flood leads on to fortune. So clearly he's putting a lot onto chance here, is my view of that.
Of course, taken at the flood is in fact what they're talking about. They're trying to decide whether to move at that particular moment and engage in battle at that particular time and place, or whether to postpone it or not.
Now, the Epicurean objection to this, in my view, would not be to say that there is no tide. Things are happening all around us that we have absolutely no control over. We only have control over some of the things. We have control over things that we do. We don't have control over things that other people do. And no amount of turning ourselves into a rock is going to solve that problem. So the Epicurean response to this might be to say we don't have to take the road that leads on to fortune. It would be possible to live a blessed life without following that necessity. But the choice is yours. That would be, I think, the response.
Yeah, and if I recall the context there, they were debating with each other about where and when to engage in battle with the forces of Octavian and Antony.
Yeah.
And if I'm remembering correctly, I think Cassius wanted to delay or move to another area, and Brutus wanted to go ahead and engage. I may have that reversed.
No, you are right. Yeah, he's trying to convince Cassius to march to Philippi.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and maybe the important point is certainly that fate did not decree their loss in that battle. Regardless of which choice they made, Cassius would have objected to saying that the gods or fate would have been the determining factor. But I think you're right, Joshua, in what you said earlier, that tides do exist. If you set your boat out against the tide, you're going to have a different result than if you go with the tide. So tides have to be considered because general flows of events do happen, but they don't happen because of the will of the gods or because the universe is totally deterministic. Cassius could have decided, I'm not going to agree with you. I'm going to move to another area. I'm not going to fight right now. And that choice of whether to fight then at that moment was theirs and not forced upon them by the gods or by fate. Part of the reason that it seems appropriate to talk about it for just a moment as we have is that Brutus does seem to be appealing to supernatural forces and the fates spinning the results for men in that argument. But regardless of the result, it wasn't the gods or fate that led Antony and Octavian to win. So if we move past 135 there to the final words of the letter, meditate therefore on these things and things akin to them night and day, and by yourself and with a companion like to yourself. And never shall you be disturbed waking or asleep, but you shall live like a god among men. For a man who lives among immortal blessings is not like unto a mortal being. That God among men phrase is a very famous one in Epicurean philosophy. So what do we make of that?
Well, earlier on in the episode, Cassius, you were using words like picture and the framework and all that to describe what we mean when we talk about the blessed life. And at that moment, I was thinking about a literal picture, and that would be the tendency by the early Epicureans to take Epicurus's face and just put it on everything. Put it on the ring on your finger, put it on a marble bust in the middle of town, put it on your wall. The tendency here, and well, by the way, this might be perceived as a problem to non-Epicureans in the ancient world, because the appearance is of being obsessed with one mortal. Well, there was another case in the ancient world where you did have a group of people who were followers of one mortal, but made claims about him that were totally discordant with the way that the Greeks and the Romans viewed the world. And I'm talking here about the early Christians and their tendency to worship what the Greeks and Romans would have thought of as clearly a man, just a person, a mortal. And you see the same thing with Alexander the Great. When he swept south, he conquered Persia and then freed the Greek city-states on the Mediterranean, and then he swept into Egypt. And when he went into Egypt, he was taken to the desert oasis of Siwa, where there's a shrine there. And he apparently allowed himself to be convinced by the Egyptians that he was no mere mortal, but in fact a god, because who else but a god could have achieved the things that he achieved? Well, that idea made him very attractive to the Egyptians, who always thought that their leaders were gods. That's what pharaohs are. They were sort of, you might think of demigods, but they were immortals who were just given the time in physical form to rule on earth. And so for the Egyptians to look at Alexander the Great that way, well, that makes sense. But for the Greeks to be expected to look at Alexander the Great that way was frankly abhorrent to them. They had no truck with the idea that you could have a person, a mortal on earth, who was also a god. And it was that problem that I say it's a problem. It's not a problem. It's the way we should think. But it was precisely that attitude that made them hostile to the Christians who they could not assimilate. It was that attitude that made them suspicious of what Alexander was trying to do in Egypt. And I think that maybe a part of that could be at work in what we see with Cicero's mockery of the Epicureans and their use of Epicurus's portrait. Because I think what they were trying to do, in addition to what Bernard Fischer thought they were doing, which was recruiting with these busts and pictures and whatnot, they were also trying to keep an image in front of their eye of what the blessed life looks like. And that's the blessed life as lived by a mortal here on earth. That's not the blessed life of the gods. If you want to see the gods, you have to use your mind's eye and just think about them. But this tendency to take one person's image and put it on everything, and a person who was not otherwise important, frankly, to the culture. He was not a conqueror. He was not a statesman. He was not a healer or a great doctor, physician. He had no right, frankly, to be cast in marble and bronze and to be put on a wall in pigment. And the tendency to do so by his followers might have seemed to outsiders as a project to deify a person. People who didn't understand that Epicurean philosophy outright denies not just deifying humans, but all supernatural gods to begin with.
Yeah, I think that's very appropriate for us to be summarizing the whole letter here on this point of visualizing, identifying what the goal is in as realistic a terms as possible, whether it's putting the face of Epicurus up as an example of a living person who was able to embody the best life. It's important to have a understanding of where you're going in order to get there. Well, we basically have come to the end of the letter, and probably for the rest of the episode, we should try to put everything in context and look at the big picture of what we're talking about. So we don't want to leave this last section without emphasizing that he's ending the letter by giving us the most practical advice about how to pursue these ideas that he's been talking about when he tells us to meditate on these things day and night, both by yourself and with people who are like yourself and who basically share the same interests and the same values and direction of this philosophy. And that allows you to live like a god among men, because people who live among immortal blessings are not really like mortals if you look at it in that way.
Let me get one more little story here and about that, and then we can move on to the general context, because this has to do with Lucretius, who drew from Ennius, but he also drew from Empedocles. And Empedocles was a very strange person. He was also convinced that he was a god like Alexander, and he died by jumping into a volcano to prove that he was immortal. All he really proved was that he was mortal and made of flesh and blood and bone. And when he jumped into a volcano, he died like a mortal. So that is all I have to say about that issue. But as far as the broader context, I think this is a very, very good ending to a great letter, and a very good way also to cap off everything we've been talking about since the letter to Herodotus, more or less. Herodotus and then Pythocles and now Menoeceus. That's 3 in the book. And now on to brilliant insights from Martin and Kalosyni.
Yeah, I have one thing. If you look at the translation of 135 from Bailey and Higgs, to me, Higgs' translation makes more sense than Bailey's translation, by just the content, no? Especially the second one. No? I mean, the first sentence maybe still you can say it's the same meaning, but the second one is really changes the meaning somewhat.
You're right, Martin. Go ahead and read that and explain it further, because I see what you're talking about, and I think you're definitely right.
So in the Higgs translation says for the second sentence, it is better, in short, that what is well judged in action should not owe its successful issue to the aid of chance. And Bailey writes, for it is better in a man's actions that what is well chosen should fail rather than what is ill chosen should be successful owing to chance. And from Higgs one, it means we should do our planning such that we do not need to rely on fate. So that means that by making reasonable assumptions and taking the right actions, we should have reasonable expectation of success. And then, of course, it may still fail. But if we don't plan properly and just count on that we are lucky, then this is a wrong way to do. But in Bailey, it is really that it states it's the wrong way.
Martin, I'm glad you brought that up because I think you're exactly right. Bailey makes it sound like it's better to fail and to have a painful ultimate result as long as you're pursuing reason, as long as you're being reasonable in the way you do things. And I think you're right. I think Epicurus would probably disagree with that. He might well say that you don't want to rely on chance, like you said, but it's certainly better in the end to have a successful result than to have a bad result. That reminds me, for some reason in my childhood, I remember one of the phrases I heard, maybe from my father or somebody else, was, it's better to be lucky than smart. And that is probably not a very wise saying to follow in general, but I think that's the issue that we're talking about. In the end, you want to be smart, but if you have to have luck in order to win your goal, then by no means are you going to reject that just because it came to you through chance.
Especially with respect to future. Now, Epicurus was very critical about certainty. That means for the future, we can plan only with some probability. That means we are aware if we make our decisions that what we do may still with some low probability have a bad outcome. So in some way, chance may still get into it, but we try to minimize it by proper planning.
Right. Joshua?
Yeah, and I think the problem here is not so much that you were helped by chance, but that you might develop this attitude of, oh, I'm just lucky. Everything just works out in the end for me. I don't have to worry. I don't have to make any hard progress or do any work. Everything just seems to work out for me. I'm favored by the gods.
Right.
An even more ridiculous way of putting it. Because sometimes it does really take hard work. You know, it takes hard work to accustom yourself to believe that death is nothing to you. People don't find that to be easy. Lucretius recognized that it was difficult and said that his verse that he was writing was a kind of honey that would make the medicine go down easier because it's not pleasant. You know, the process is difficult. And if you think that everything's just going to work out for you in the end, I don't have to think about these things because everything's just going to be all right. I think it's more the attitude that Epicurus has a problem with than simply, you know, oh, chance was good to me today. Although even that would be a problematic formulation.
So I have something to add here because earlier, Cassius, you brought up about suicide. And also we've been talking about free will and personal responsibility. And so I started thinking, when a person has ideas about suicide, suicidal ideation, is it possible that they are somehow succumbing to some feeling that there's a fate involved in their life that they can't overcome, so that they're somehow not in full control of their life, or somehow they're unlucky and by chance life has unfolded in a certain way and they just somehow can't escape out of that? So there's almost a denial of free will in that sense when somebody starts thinking that suicide is a choice that would be good.
Joshua, you want to take that first or shall I?
Well, let me expand on the question because there's another issue with free will, and that is, what if I am coming to the philosophy late and I've spent 40 years of my life making nothing but wrong decisions, and I have no room now to make any significant changes because I've allowed myself to become trapped. That's, I think, a feeling that comes up when you talk about the feeling of suicide or intrusive thoughts or ideation. I've done everything wrong now and it's too late to fix things. I don't have an answer to that, but that might be a way to expand.
Of course, whenever we start talking about suicide, the first thing we need to always remember is that sometimes people who have these issues can in fact be under the influence of disease processes or issues of the brain that don't have the ability to think your way out of them. And they need clinical help and medical care. And they always should be thinking about that. If they ever get anywhere close to thinking that this is the best way out, they need to first exhaust all of those alternatives for treatment and so forth. But Kalosyni, I think basically your question is correct. People get themselves in situations all the time where they believe they are trapped. They believe they have no alternative way of dealing with it that's satisfactory to them. And rather than attempt to deal with it in some other way, they look upon exiting life as the only option. And Epicurus has said, even in this letter, that life is desirable, and it makes the most sense to exhaust all possibilities for improving things for yourself. And you see suicide as an absolute last resort because you know that nothing happens to you after that point. There's no hope for anything after that.
Right. And I still want to add that it's not just a matter of some type of mental illness, but I'm saying, could it be just some kind of erroneous thinking pattern that is almost on a subliminal unconscious level regarding fate? That even in the modern world, somehow this idea of fate still continues in how some people think. And that when people think about suicide, they really need to stop and think, are they believing somehow that there is some fate in their lives? And that this is not a correct way of thinking about the world and how to live. And so with Epicureanism, I see this as an actual therapeutic thing for anyone who is considering suicide, to really go into what it means to have free will, what it means to take personal responsibility and to make choices in life. So I just wanted to add that all in.
I think what Kalosyni describes sounds like a fate neurosis. So that if someone really thinks that fate always gives him the bad outcomes, so that it could very well be that this person suffers from fate neurosis and possibly also more subconsciously takes the action in a way that it has to fail or is likely to fail. No? So it is something that actually exists. And in that case, those people should rather go to a psychologist for help, some other similar professional help on that matter. No?
Sometimes, though, it's not about what the world is doing to me, though. It's not like, oh, I'm just fated to fail and everything bad happens to me. Sometimes it's about the way that people talk about themselves. And if you view yourself constantly in a negative way, then eventually you poison your self-esteem to such a level that you don't think that you can do any good. Not just that something bad's going to happen to you, but that you can't take action that will make anything better. I feel somewhat ill-equipped to talk about this issue.
Well, it has lots of components to it, not just from the straight psychological issue of how you think and just your thought processes, but several people here have mentioned, even in the modern world, well, I don't know that this issue is all that different from what many people who are considered to be part of mainstream religion in the United States today, when you start talking basically Calvinist or Reform theology that believes that God from the beginning of the universe has ordained that everything should happen exactly as it happens, and that everything is just part of that chain of events from the beginning of time. I mean, that is still today a widely held belief among people who are otherwise healthy in mind and body in general. If you take that kind of position, then you're going to find yourself in these traps. And from that point of view, the philosophical worldview, physics point of view, absolutely, that's where Epicurus is targeting these comments. You can unwind those feelings of helplessness and the fate of supernatural gods and the fate of destiny and fate. You can unwind that by studying nature and realizing that those things do not and cannot exist, and that they're figments of people's imaginations or manipulation or worse. So, yeah, I think that really is the key aspect of what Epicurus is doing here. For those people who are in relatively healthy condition, but who are suffering from false beliefs about the nature of the universe, to me, that's the very focus of Epicurean philosophy, is showing those people the way out of those problems. It's much more difficult when you have people who are not philosophically oriented and who have just absorbed from the culture around them these ideas that everything is out of their control. There's the cliche about when people conclude they have nothing to lose, they lose it. And it's bad to just give in to this idea that there's nothing you can do. Because in fact, when you do take steps, if you were considering ending your life or taking some other kind of dramatic action, that's an example of how Epicurus is right. You do have control over many of the events of your life.
I do have something I could talk about here, and it's something I didn't think of when we were talking about Epicurus living a meager, measly life on just bread and water. And Don has done some very interesting work on the forum of trying to put some context around this bread and water issue by actually going to the trouble of making himself some barley bread. Part of it, he said, was a dismal failure. Part of it worked out okay. But just this morning, I thought of another angle on this. And I should point out also that Kalosyni found a good article on barley bread and how it was actually, in some ways, a luxury compared to simply wheat flour. But this is a story that comes from a guy I've talked about earlier in the episode. This is Alexander the Great. And this is Dinocrates, who was, in a weird way, the person that he chose, the person that he selected, hired to design and build his city, the city of Alexandria on the north coast of Africa, west of the Nile Delta. And it's interesting because in Greece and in Macedon and maybe even in Italy, you've got a lot of chalk. The rock it can be ground into a fine chalk. And then the surveyors, when they went out to lay out roads, when they went to lay out buildings, palaces, temples, theaters, gardens, they would take a crew out with a whole bunch of bags of chalk. And then where the surveyors laid out lines, the workmen would lay down lines of chalk after them. Well, Egypt, or at least North Egypt, where they were, didn't have chalk. And so this was their solution. And this comes from a book that I've talked about quite a lot on the forum. This is The Rise and Fall of Alexandria by Justin Pollard and Howard Reed. And I don't know what their primary source citation for this is, but they say, crisscrossing the sandy shore were lines of barley flour, carefully poured out by workmen walking behind teams of surveyors who calculated angles and distances using tools unchanged since the days of the pyramid builders. The entire area now lay under a net of these white lines, attended to by countless small birds that did their best to eat them as fast as they were laid. So why did they use barley flour? Well, they didn't have chalk. I've already mentioned that. The other reason they used barley flour is because Alexander had to feed an army. And so he had a lot of barley flour because that's what the army was eating. So this image of Epicurus, I think, sitting in a cave and eating bread and water and having no ambition or desire to do anything, it simply does not follow, because here Alexander is with an army and a whole bunch of barley flour, shiploads of it. And not only does he have ambition, but he is the archetype of ambition, the paragon of ambition. And his army goes on to conquer most of what at that time was the known world. So just because we're eating bread does not mean that we are living miserable, wretched lives stuck in a cave, I guess is the direction I want to go with that. And the letter to Menoeceus, when you read it in its whole context and when you consider it more broadly in the context of everything that survives from Epicurean philosophy, in the context of Lucretius, in the context of what we have from Diogenes Laertius, in the context of Cicero and on ends, in the context of the inscription at Oenwanda, in the context of the surviving fragments of the papyrus rolls of Philodemus in Herculaneum. The broad picture, all in my eye, seems to tell the same story. And it's the story of what it means to live a blessed life. And it's precisely what Epicurus says here in the letter to Menoeceus.
I think that's a great analogy, Joshua, about Alexander's army and the barley issue. That's what armies do. That's what soldiers do in the middle of fighting. They have simple meals available to them that sustains their strength and allows them to do the fighting and achieve their goals, but it's not luxury out on the battlefield. It can be a harsh struggle in life to achieve the things that you want to achieve. And that, to me, is exactly where Epicurus is going with the discussion of simplicity in diet and simplicity in way of life. It equips you to be strong in the face of adversity and to push forward to achieve the things you want to achieve in the limited lifespan that you have. You were citing at the end, I think you're talking about basically that same section from Torquatus again, about the ideal is that the man is living in continuous enjoyment of numerous and vivid pleasures alike of body and mind, undisturbed either by the presence or the prospect of pain. And Torquatus says, what possible state of existence could we describe as being more excellent or more desirable? So there's that phrasing that's reflected in both Torquatus and the Letter to Menoeceus, that the best way of life is to live in the constant enjoyment of numerous and vivid pleasures of body and of mind, undisturbed by the presence or the prospect of pain. And that's where the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain fit together. So you've got this visualization of the goal, but then you have to decide how you're going to get there. And that's where the simplicity of diet and lifestyle comes in. Because as Torquatus says, one so situated must possess in the first place a strength of mind that is proof against all fear of death and of pain. And strength of mind and knowing these things are affirmative choices. They're actions that we have to take. We can't just be passive billiard balls waiting to just react to what's around us. We have to engage our minds to understand the big picture so that we can play our role in making sure that our pleasure is maximized and our pain is minimized. But you do that through knowing these things of the basic philosophy that Epicurus is teaching, and not just floating through life wondering what's right and what's wrong and thinking everything is basically the same. You always return to those basics about let such a man have no dread of supernatural power, never let him suffer the pleasures of the past to fade away, but renew them in recollection, and his lot will be one of which will not admit of further improvement. So there's specific ways that Epicurus is suggesting that you achieve these results that we've been talking about. We're coming to the end of a normal length episode, so let's talk about final ways to comment on what we think is the takeaway from the letter to Menoeceus. And as usual, we should go to Martin to start with.
Currently I have no idea how to put this in short.
Joshua or Kalosyni, how about final thoughts for today?
So I'm looking at the very end of this letter, and I still have some questions for my own self because I don't fully feel like I understand the very end. It talks about living like gods among men. And so I am still going to be pondering and meditating upon what that means. In some sense, we could have a whole episode just discussing that. To me, at least, that's what I think, because I think there's a lot there.
I mentioned that, the Greeks of Epicurus's world might be hostile to somebody who takes this view that it's possible to live like a god, in a sense. You're not a god. You don't have the power or the immortality of a god, but in the blessings of your life, you are like a god. I mentioned that some of the Greeks might have a problem with that, but there was one Greek in particular who was, this ties back into my whole barley flour thing, who was a contemporary of Epicurus and who was a boy of about the same age of Epicurus and in the same cohort as Epicurus. That's probably not the right word. That's more of a Latin word, but who served the necessary and required mandatory 2-year minimum military training with Epicurus. And I'm talking here about the celebrated playwright Menander. And Menander in the Greek anthology means garland of flowers. So this is a group of preserved poems, epitaphs, epigrams, little laconic snippets of wisdom that come down to us from the ancient world. Menander says, "Hail, you twin-born sons of Menoeceus, of whom the one saved his country from slavery, the other from folly." So I mentioned earlier, what achievement did Epicurus make that would allow him to have his students and pupils and successors carve his face in marble and put it up all over town. Well, this is the achievement. Themistocles was a general and a statesman who averted a military disaster that was impending in Athens, but it was Epicurus, according to Menander, who saved Athens and indeed the world from folly, from false belief, from superstition, from fate and fortune, chance, destiny, and predetermination. And it was Epicurus who gave us the method. As Torquatus said, he was the master builder of the life of happiness. And so in order to live like a god among men, according to Epicurus, you have to live the life of blessedness, because you've taken Epicurus's advice on this subject and you've rejected about the gods any claims that are made about their capriciousness, their lust, any intervention they make in the affairs of people, their diverse and angry and capricious personalities. To live like a god, in other words, according to Epicurus, is to live like an Epicurean god, which is a life of deepest peace, unmixed with any fear of pain or death or anxiety, with any fear of divine retribution, and full of the life of pleasure.
Joshua, I think in expanding what you're saying there, somebody who is talking about living like a god and addressing Kalosyni's question, there's also the beginning of Book 5 of Lucretius's poem, where Epicurus is in fact analogized to a god. There may be something worth saying there. Book 5 starts out, who can, with all his soul inspired, compose fit numbers worthy of the majesty of such great things of these discoveries, or who in words alone can sing his praise and equal his deserts, who from the labor of his mind has left such benefits and bestowed rewards so glorious on mankind. No mortal man alive, as I conceive, for could I raise my verse to reach the dignity of things he knew, he was a god, my noble Menoeceus, a god he was who first found out that rule of life which is now called true wisdom, and who this human life so tossed with storms and so overwhelmed in darkness has been rendered by his art so calm and placed in so clear a light. And then he continues on, unless the mind be purged, what wars within, what dangers wretched mortals must endure, what piercing cares of fierce desire must tear the minds of men. And then the man, therefore, that subdued these monsters and drove them from the mind by precept, not by force, should not this man be worthy to be numbered with the gods? Especially since of these immortal deities he has spoken nobly and by his writings has explained to us the laws of universal nature. So probably what Lucretius is talking about there in Book 5 is related to what Epicurus would be saying in terms of living as a god among men, that you are, by understanding the philosophy and talking about it and engaging with it, you're experiencing this ability to realize that the pleasures of life are worth whatever pains we do have to endure. And even though as mortals, we don't have the ability to continue to do that forever, we can share in the experience while we are alive.
Cassius, that was a very good answer. I think, Kalosyni, you partially gave your own answer when you said that your approach was to meditate on the question, because that, to me, is the heart of the advice that we get from the letter to Menoeceus. Meditate on these things, whether alone or with persons like yourself, night and day. That is the way that we have to approach this question. We're not going to solve everything right now. I've probably derailed Cassius's attempt to solve it right now, but it's the meditating alone and with company, night and day. That, to me, is the ultimate suggestion on how we should continue to explore philosophy that we get from the letter to Menoeceus.
Yeah, meditation is an action. It's an activity. It's engaging. It's taking a positive step towards pursuing what you're looking for, as opposed to just giving in and being a billiard ball and being a slave of supernatural religion or false philosophy. It means engagement and study, the study of nature, which is so important to Lucretius and Epicurus both, that Epicurus says is the way he finds his happiness, through the study of nature. Those are actions that you take. You choose to pursue these good things. You're not just a slave or a pawn of outside forces. You have the ability through your mind to make lemonade from lemons.
Well, and I would say that living like the gods is going to be not just making lemonade out of lemons, but something far grander and far superior.
There's definitely no absolute way that everybody has to live their lives, and no list of choices that everybody has to follow. The feeling of pleasure is individual, and cliches like lemons from lemonade is helpful, just like it's helpful to say pursue pleasure and avoid pain. But we each have to translate that into reality because we're the ones who are living our lives. Nobody else is. I feel like we're not on the final point yet, though. Joshua, any other wrap up here?
My instinct is to read the Torquatus material and put a pin on that.
And as you're finding that, Joshua, one of the things you've always said in these podcasts is that we've come to the end of the letter to Menoeceus, but only the beginning of our attempts to apply the letter to Menoeceus to our own lives. Simply reading isn't the end of anything. It's the beginning of wisdom, maybe, but what we're here is not to pursue wisdom, but actually to live happily. And that means making decisions of our own and pursuing them to a successful conclusion, if at all possible. So that's what we have to do. And we can't do that unless we keep in mind what the goal is.
Actually, I changed my mind. Since we're capping off all of the letters to Epicurus here, except for the will, I can now read the ending of the Torquatus material, which might even be better, where he says, "If then the doctrine I have set forth is clearer and more luminous than daylight itself, if it is derived entirely from nature's source, if my whole discourse relies throughout for confirmation on the unbiased and unimpeachable evidence of the senses, if lisping infants, nay, even dumb animals, prompted by nature's teaching, almost find voice to proclaim that there is no welfare but pleasure, no hardship but pain, and their judgment in these matters is neither sophisticated nor biased, ought we not to feel the greatest gratitude to him who caught this utterance of nature's voice and grasped its import so firmly and so fully that he has guided all sane-minded men into the paths of peace and happiness, calmness and repose?"
That's a great way to end the episode. Obviously, Epicurus did not write that himself, but several hundred years later, by the time of Cicero, someone else had written that Cicero incorporated into his book. And in doing so, they left for us one of the best statements we have for summarizing the whole importance of the philosophy and what we can and should do with it. So why don't we close with that for the day, and we'll come back next week. We will continue pursuing the philosophy of Epicurus. It looks like we're probably going to go into the inscription from Diogenes of Oinoander, but we'll make a final decision and bring it to you next week. Thank you for your time and listening to us today. We invite you to come by the forum where we have a thread on this and many other topics. So we'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.